Malaysian architect, 1887 to 2017. Yang berbahagia Datuk Sri Dr. Anwar Fazal, Chairman of Think City. Yang berbahagia Datin Sri Irene Yap, Architect and Chairperson of the Penang Philharmonic. Yang berusaha Datuk Dr. Oi Ki Beng, Executive Director of the Penang Institute. Yang berusaha Datuk Chok Lei Leng, General Manager of the Penang Hill Corporation. Yang berbahagia Datuk Tan Lei Sa, Chairperson of Phoenix Press. Distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon and welcome to the official launch of the book, The Penang House, Rise of the Malaysian Architect, 1887 to 2017. This book traces the evolution of our local Malaysian architects as distinct from the British and colonial practices which dominated the 19th century. For the people of Penang, as well as for international architectural enthusiasts, this book is an important document, for it sheds light upon the local Penang architects and their buildings. This is especially the case as instead of merely photographic views, this book has recorded the properties in detailed plans and elevations, which are essential for any serious architectural publication. The author, Dr. John San Hock Lim, had defined the early architectural identity of Penang in his first book, The Penang House and the Straits Architect, 1887 to 1941. This book was published in 2015, and the demand for that book has seen the entire print run sold out. This second volume complements the first and completes the task of being an exploratory essay in the field of intercolonial and vernacular architectural study. In this lavishly illustrated book, The Penang House, Rise of the Malaysian Architect, 1887 to 2017, Dr. Lim has researched and documented the development and maturation of the Penang architectural identity. It is a seminal publication that will encourage further study by upcoming generations to ensure that the history of the architectural practice in Penang is not lost to time. Ladies and gentlemen, as interesting and as important as the subject of this book may be, it would not have seen the light of day without the vision and support of its publishers, Entrepot Publishing. With its core focus on the publication and distribution of fine books on a variety of subjects with a concentration on Southeast Asia, Entrepot has nurtured many local talents in the process of producing their inspiring range of publications. Entrepot Publishing is helmed by two accomplished authors, Mr. Marcus Langdon and Mr. Keith Hopkins. With this in mind, I would like to invite Mr. Marcus Langdon on stage to say a few words. Mr. Langdon is acknowledged as the leading authority on Penang's early history under the East India Company. He has written and contributed to many published works on Penang and in scholarly journals. His research findings have been widely cited by heritage advocates, architects, conservationists, and historians. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Marcus Langdon.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It's been a while. What happened in between? I think we're all still tentatively coming out from this 2 years of hibernation that we've had with COVID, and so glad to see that we've got pretty much a full house for this event. So that has something to say about how keen people are to get things back in going again. My fellow director Keith Hopkins, who's sitting up there on the sales book sales desk at the moment, and I are very gratified to see so many people come here especially as quite a few have travelled from KL and Singapore and even some from the US. So it's fantastic to see you all, thank you. But you didn't come to see me, so I'll just keep this very brief. Producing this book was a little bit like climbing in the Himalayas. A lot of planning the best route. There was meeting a lot of wonderful people along the way. There were certainly some steep climbs and challenging climbs and some deep ravines. But once we reached the summit, the elation on realizing that we produced something really amazing is fantastic. So it's been a terrific experience for me. I must thank John Lim and Doreen Lim. We've become quite close over the years of dealing with this book, and I've learned so much during the process of publication. I also wanted to just quickly thank those who were involved in the publication of the book. We have here Dato' Tan Lay Sa, is chairman of Phoenix Press, who published the book. They're continuing their standard, world-class standard of producing books, and we've been extremely pleased with their service, and the staff, Catherine and TC Hon. I also wanted to thank Cecilia Mack, I'm not sure if she's here, for the graphic layout of the book. Quite a challenge with the number of plans and photos and drawings and all sorts of things that we have in the book, and I think she's done a fantastic job as usual. Also wanted to thank the late Kay Lyons. She was an editor for us living in KL, sadly passed away in the early days of the pandemic, not from COVID. And the job was ably taken up from there by Laotsi Saka, who is here. And she took over with editing and indexing. Thank you to all. But let's get the show on the road. I'll now hand you back to our MC, Mr. Jack Ong, to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Dato' Judy Chang Hopkins. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Langdon. Ladies and gentlemen, to officially launch the book, we are very fortunate today to have with us a true Penang icon, Yang Berbahagia Dato' Judy Chang Hopkins. Dato' Chang Hopkins is the only Malaysian to have been recognized by Forbes in 2011 as one of the 10 most important women at the United Nations. Her stellar career with the UN spanned 36 years, and just listing her achievements will take up the whole afternoon. From her boots on the ground days, working mainly in Africa with the United Nations Development Programme, she went on to hold several UN directorships before becoming the Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees in 2006 and the Assistant Secretary General for Peace Building in 2009. Following her retirement from the UN, Dr. Chang Hopkins was appointed by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as Special Advisor to the University for Peace in Costa Rica. Not one to slow down, she was then appointed as Adjunct Professor at Columbia University in 2015, before retiring in 2019. With close ties to Penang, having been born here and educated at St. George's Girls' School and St. Xavier's Institution, Dr. Chang Hopkins is also the great-granddaughter of Leong Fee of the Ipoh tin mining fame. Penang is extremely proud of Dr. Chang Hopkins, and we are privileged to have her presence here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage our most distinguished guest of honor, Yang Berbahagia Dr. Judy Chang Hopkins.
Good afternoon to everybody. In case you're wondering, well, how come I have a sun visor on in the dark room? I have a problem with glare, so this is not an old lady trying to look cool. I have a glare, and somehow it cuts the glare when I wear this visor. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, we launched John's first volume book in 2015. I still remember at the ENO, we had a lot of fun. You know, that book was I thought it was, you know, really quite brilliant in the sense that, you know, it showed us through an architect's eye something that was a lot more significant. It was, you know, it was documenting the historical period in the history of Malaya, Penang, where the Chinese immigrants had finally made it, and they were the millionaires of the day, I suppose the billionaires of today. And in their wildest dreams back home, they would have never imagined they would have reached the kind of success they did here. And in order to, you know, to prove it to themselves and to others around them, they wanted these, you know, this fantastic mansions built. And as you can see on Northern Road, they didn't want anything that looked like back home. They didn't want a China house. They wanted European mansions. And it was that happy convergence of the presence of young European architects in Malaya at that time, probably bored to tears, you know, just designing government buildings, suddenly having been commissioned to design these fantastical European mansions for these newly rich millionaires and billionaires. And so there you have it, you know, what we have today, these wonderful buildings, so well documented in John's first book. And as I had said back then, the brilliance of it was, instead of telling a story in a normal historical way of how these people came and made it and enslaved and everything and made it, he told it through the lens of architecture, you know, through the buildings and everything that went into the care and love that they put into these buildings and what we see today. As I said, I thought it was a very novel way to tell the story through an architect's eye. And the reason I repeat it is because I think it's important for us. You know, we all take it for granted. I think it's important for us to really understand the contribution of that group of immigrants to the modernization of Malaya at that time, to the development of Malaya, you know, to the industrialization that we tend to take for granted. It was that pioneering group that had come and succeeded, that leapfrogged us, you know, into the modern era. You know, there are many descendants of these people around the room. I won't mention, you know, we know them, but I'm the proud descendant of one, Liang Fi, whom, you know, I'm proud to say, not only was a tin miner, but he modernized, he mechanized tin mining in the Tambun mines in Perak. He was the first person to import machinery from England so that it went from the labor-intensive tin mining to mechanize and thus produce record numbers of tin, record tonnage of tin. So enough about that. At that time, of course, at that launching of that book, you know, I made fun of John. So a few nights ago, he asked me, "Are you gonna make fun of me again?" You know, I don't know how many of you were there at that launch, but you know, I exposed the secret of John, which is that even though he knows a lot about Penang and he writes a lot about Penang, he has never really lived in Penang. So do you remember what I called him, the ones who were there? I gave him a name. I called him a Penang boy wannabe. Somebody, you know, I mean, I say it jokingly, but I also say that with great admiration. You know, I'm not a Penang girl wannabe. I'm a real Penang girl, period. But for those of us, you know, who have stayed here and lived here, it's really hard not to have your heart here, you know, even though you may have left. So same with John and with me. And that's the one thing we have in common, I think, is our bond to Penang. So at that time, of course, we made a lot of fun about it. But today, of course, we're here launching a separate book, a different book. I think Marcus had told me of Entrepreneur. Again, congratulations for having published such a yet another beautiful volume. But Marcus had told me that John had already started writing about the Malaysian architects, even when he was writing the first book, but it was so long that he didn't have enough space. That's the second volume that we're inaugurating today. So this second volume is about the growth of the Malaysian, our own homegrown architects. As you know, architecture is a profession that takes quite a lot of formal education, takes years, certification, etc. So it took a while before we got our own homegrown architects. And in fact, many of them understudied the European architects that were here. And then, their sons and daughters went on to carry on the tradition. And so we have, this growth of these Penang Malaysian architects, with their various styles. They were mirrored styles. It was not one style per se, but we have, as detailed in the book, the radio house, the iconic, if you wish, Penang terrace houses. And as he documents again, it went through many iterations of terrace houses. And of course, always these houses were always in keeping with the environment, with the tropics, always airy, but again, not one style. So as he documents in the book, it went from the early days, the pre-war, post-war, from conservative to maybe more adventurous. But then, and then later on, and today we see the very adventurous, the very modernistic, very modern houses, and I'm always impressed by houses built on slopes of hills in Penang. Penang is a very hilly island, and to take advantage of that and the fantastic views and the dramatic the houses you can create, I'm so pleased to say that I'm truly impressed by these houses built on slopes of hills. I think one of them was actually built by my friend sitting right here, Miss Irene Yap. I won't mention which house, but that was a spectacular house on the slope that she has built, that she has designed. So I'm not an architect, so I'm not going to stand here and discuss, the architecture of the present period. John will do that. I believe he has a treat for you, a lecture on that. But if you allow me, I would like to digress a little bit. I'd like to digress a little bit because I feel strongly about it. I feel a responsibility being a Penangite. I come home every year or every other year. So I see things in periods of 1 year periods, right? I see new buildings, new developments, in 1 year periods. I even see traffic jams in 1 year periods. My husband and I were just commenting, the big traffic jams before Gurney Drive and Kalawai Road became one-way streets, and then it became one-way, and then suddenly the traffic jams were eased. And then now, of course, we're back to the bad old days. Traffic jams have started again. I'm coming to that later. But when I came back, a lot more seriously, as I guess it was in the, 10, 15 years ago, it was during the euphoria, if you wish, of Penang being granted heritage site status by UNESCO. I was very impressed by the work of my friend at Salma Koo at that time and her PhD. I was actually quite involved in fundraising and trying to raise awareness and all that. So when I went back, I was so inspired when I went back to New York that I wrote a piece for The Star that was over 10 years ago called Heritage at a Crossroads. And that's the way I saw it. I saw Penang as heritage on a crossroads, starting to see Love Lane and those areas, so-called marginal areas, suddenly developed into quite fancy buildings. But I also heard, the arguments, the fights, the controversies over what should be preserved and what should be pulled down. And I thought, at that time, we were at that point of deciding, do we want to, to modernize completely and do away with those, or do we want to preserve some of our culture? So I wrote this piece with a lot of questions, and I'm afraid to say today, 10 years later, we're still at that point. We're still at that point. People always ask that question, does Penang want to be Singapore? And if you were to do a survey of Penang people, I bet you they would say yes. But that is it's a stupid question. It's disingenuous. It's misleading. There's no comparison. Penang is an island in a federation. Singapore is a nation state. Singapore is a nation. Its its leaders had to forge a way for it to survive economically. So it had to make a lot of hard decisions, that are just not comparable. They had to make decisions for it to develop, and looking back, I don't know, one can still argue, but you must admit Singapore is one of the most successful developing countries in the world. It's in the rank of the European countries, Switzerland, in terms of GDP per capita and other such factors. So it's not comparable. It's not comparable whatsoever. But I would say that I see still a struggle within our society, within our communities, and the struggle is, let's be very honest about it, between on the one hand, the more romantic types who want to preserve, who feel that our cultural heritage is so strong that it has to be preserved, versus the ones who want to go for full modernization, full steam ahead, and let's not forget the developers and the profits and gains to be made investing in these areas. So I want to be very balanced and fair, and this I'll tell you right away, that I see both sides, but I'm a strong one, and I see both sides because no matter how you look at it, Penang is a thriving place. It thrived during the colonial period. It thrived as a straight settlement. It's thriving today. So and today it's moving on. It's moving on to manufacturing, to IT and other areas. So, and the population is growing, as you can see. So there's no question there is a need for infrastructure and for development to take place. There's no question. But on the other hand, our heritage is so strong. Our history, as I said, from the early days, through today, it's so strong that it will be truly, I think, really silly and really, what's the word for it? Really visionless to have total no vision to say let's cut everything down, because it's such a comparative advantage that we have, and the advantage is not just intangible in terms of what we can teach our children and show our children so they can be proud of our heritage and past. That's also, if you wish, an economic value, because with the heritage site status brought tourism to Penang, and yes, you can look at the good and bad of it, but the fact of the matter is, we need jobs, we need a way for people to make good living, and there's no question that that tourism can play that role if it's well managed. So, as I said, I'm digressing a little bit, but I think being a Penangite and loving this place for what it is, I just want to highlight the crucial need to really grapple and handle this debate instead of sweeping it under the rug. We cannot sweep it under the rug. As I said, there are both sides, the need for development. We are thriving, we will be thriving, and thus you cannot, Penang cannot be a museum, right? But on the other hand, how silly to destroy all the comparative advantages we had in terms of our rich cultural past and heritage. So I know, I don't want to get into the whole debate about the role of the state government. I know that there are arguments about political will, whether there's real political will, whether they have discretionary power by keeping this whole question of what is heritage and what isn't, that the government has discretionary power to allow developments to take place willy-nilly, without some logic, without some criteria. So I'm aware of all that, but that's reality. Political will is really hard to operationalize when you're sitting in that political position. But I would strongly urge, though, I have friends here who are dealing now with the latest controversy over the Burma Square area. And I guess that's the next big thing now in this whole heritage area. But I would strongly urge that our community, the government, really grapples with this. In America, there's a term we use about kicking the can down the road, right? Kicking the can down the road. Something is so difficult, you don't want to deal with it, you just kick it down the road. And I'll be very frank with you, that's what I'm seeing here in terms of how we're dealing with our heritage issue. We are kicking that can down the road, and soon it might be too late to turn around certain developments and certain factors. And when I think about it, it's so not rocket science. When you look at all the great, the Romes of this world, Italy, all the countries that have done so well in preservation, there are ways, and as I said, it's not rocket science. There are ways to come up with a good local plan that can benefit, everybody. So, again, sorry for digressing, but I feel very strongly about it. I just wanted to raise it as somebody who has a stake in this island. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chang Hopkins. We request that you remain on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to invite Dr. John San Hock Lin and Mr. Marcus Langdon to join Dr. Chang Hopkins for the official launch of the book. Dr. Chang Hopkins will unveil the special commemorative poster of the book, and together with Dr. John Lin, Mr. Marcus Langdon will sign the autographs on it. Big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. There is also a special presentation by a former student of Dr. John Lin, Mr. Richard Chang, who would like to present a cake to Dr. John Lin on the occasion of this official launch of the book. I believe Mr. Richard Chang has traveled from Singapore for this.
Hi, John. Almost 30 years ago, I was a young student that was taught by you. And during this period, I became a senior management in order in some of the global firms in the world, the American firms. And I owe you a debt of personal gratitude. That where I am today is because of you. And I thank you for your mentorship and your friendship over the years. And I'm indeed blessed and privileged to witness the birth of your new book, The Penang House. Thank you very much, John. Love you.
Mr. John Lin, Dr. John Lin will now cut the cake as a show of appreciation to Mr. Richard Tang. Another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chang Hopkins, Dr. John Lin, and Mr. Marcus Langdon, and Mr. Richard Tang.
Don't drop it.
Together, stay together. Thank you very much. Let me help you down the steps.
Yeah, I'll go this way.
Ladies and gentlemen, this book, The Penang House, Rise of the Malaysian Architect, 1887 to 2017, was researched and written by Dr. Chang San Hock Lim. In the course of research for his first and then his second publication, he unearthed material evidence that the local architects charted their own course of progress and consolidates the view that Penang had much to do with establishing local architectural identity and development. His conviction is that Penang is in fact the architectural cradle of modern Malaya and Malaysia. Dr. John Lim's research in this area spans decades, where he has actively collected archival and oral history relating to the architects of Penang. This is in order to identify the origins of Penang's architectural practice and examine its development to the present day. His previous publications include a monograph entitled The Shophouse Rafflesia, a diffusion of Malayan prototype in Southeast Asia in 1992, and Architecture of Southeast Asia, published in the centennial edition of Sir Bannister Fletcher's A History of Architecture in 1996. He has also served as editor of Transporting Traditions, produced by the ASEAN Studies publication series. The first volume of this book, The Penang House and the Straits Architect, 1887 to 1941, was published in 2015. Dr. John Lim was born in Malaya in 1942, and in addition to his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Melbourne, he holds a PhD from the National University of Singapore. He lectured at the NUS School of Architecture from 1972 to 2002. It gives me great pleasure to now invite Dr. John Lim to present a talk on the book, The Penang House, Rise of the Malaysian Architect, 1887 to 2017. There is also time after his talk when you can ask him questions related to the book. Ladies and gentlemen, the man of the hour, Dr. John San Hock Lim.
Today, my heart is full to see so many of you present at this book launch. My dear relatives, friends, special supporters, students, and all, I express my heartfelt thanks to all of you coming for this launch event. You have come from Singapore, KL, and elsewhere, and traveled at a time when anxiety over COVID is still at large. I am very grateful. Thank you for making it here. I want to thank Dr. Judy Chang Hopkins for launching this book today. You do me great honor. My thanks also goes to Anthropo publisher Marcus Landon for working with me for so many years to help me make this book possible. Last but not least, my wife Doreen, for her unflinching support and sacrifices she made throughout these 50 years of my academic life and research. I wish my late parents were here too, and to see the fruits of my work, because when I visit Penang, my time was always spent out to research and photography, and also my late brother, Datuk Lim San Ho, for introducing me to Tunku Abdul Rahman, who gave me great support in this. I therefore dedicate this book to Tunku Abdul Rahman for his inspiration and support to my research. In those days, the Penang chapter of architects visited the Tunku regularly because he inspired good works in them. Here, we see Dennis Liu in the center presenting a check to him in aid of the flood victims in Aceh, Sumatra. Dennis then was the chairman of the Penang chapter. And in our recent conversation, a family member close to the Tunkus, her name is Datin Sri Liliana Nereng, says, and I quote, "It is good that there are many decent people who remember him and his good deeds," close quote. It has taken well over 40 years for me to gather information for this book. I have learned that information gathering is not free. It is about relationships, culture, and importance of filial piety, peppered with lots of patience, endurance, thick skin, thick faith. Do you think I could write this book by simply downloading information from the internet, computer? Actually, I would say it's not possible. Let me tell you a story. But perhaps just to introduce to you, it's from the first to the second wave of architects, the father and son architects. On the left is Lim Sulun. On the right is his son, Lim Yong Fong. Bottom, we see Chu Eng Yam and his son, Chu Hopkins. Let me tell you a story. I could not have recorded one of the greatest accounts of filial piety without the blessings of these relationships. Two well-known Penang family architects, Lim Sulun and Chu Eng Yam, and together with their sons, Lim Yong Fong and Chu Hopkins, chalk up over 100 years of architectural practice in Penang. I am proud to name them as the father and son architects, as they remind us of our Asian culture of supporting and working within the family, which is not often seen among the new generation. Lim Su Loon, 1889 till 1976, became a registered architect 1927, continued to be a registered architect in 1951, registered again under LAM, the Board of Architects, 1962, and a member of PAM, Persekutuan Architect Malaysia. I had visited his family at Dunlop Road for more than 10 years, but got no favorable response in those days. The first meeting I had with Mrs. Lim Yong Fong was about the last time she agreed to see me. She refused to talk about the past, saying, "這物件故事是古早的物件了，無用講了." But I continued to persist and visited her many times. She avoided me, she saw me. It was the window and the wonderful woman, that lady in the window. But when I approached towards the window, she disappears. And I had to do this year after year, even Chinese New Year. I would try to create a presence, a rapport. So, out of desperation, I sent a letter to her. Again, no response. After her demise, her son and son-in-law, Lim Kok Beng and Wong Loi Ming, respectively, read my letter, which was kept in Lim Yong Fong's cabinet with all his plans and personal papers. I was then contacted. To my surprise, this cabinet was a treasure trove for me. I sought permission from the family to donate this personal archive to the School of Architecture in NUS. It is today stored in CASA of the school. I hope that my story will encourage future researchers not to give up, but to have forbearance, patience, hope, accompanied by much passion, tenacity. The same goes on for my research on Chu Ing Yam and his son Chu Kok King. Let me just bring you to the photo of architect Chu Ing Yam and his bride Teo Cheng Po. The photograph of this wedding photo was 1920s, during the golden age of Penang's architecture. Then his son, architect Chu Kok King, and his bride Lim Siu Si, taken sometime in the very late 1930s. And not too far behind, the year 2012, Mrs. Chu Kok King, who is Madam Lim Siu Si, and her daughter, Madam Chu Lei Hua, visited me in Singapore. I am so grateful to have the privilege of meeting these very precious people. So grateful that Madam Chu Lei Hua and her husband are among us here, having made a trip from Singapore. Now, let me introduce you. I inquired through my relatives in Penang. I finally got in touch after more than 10 years with Mrs. Chu Kok King and her daughter, Chu Lei Hua. This opens up a wonderful relationship with the Chu family. I was able to receive more building plans and first-hand information on Chu Kok King and Chu Ing Yam. Today, it would not have been possible to curate the lives of these two great Penang families, Lim Su Loon and Chu Ing Yam. Now let's turn to this wonderful benchmark of Penang architecture. The new townhouse typology in Penang. These are townhouses simulating a modern urban kampong. Another value I learned was from Patriarch Chia Leong Kia. He wanted his family to live close together, so he appointed Chu Ing Yam to build 39 units of townhouses in Bangkok Lane. Today, this tradition still holds. Only those related to the Chia family are allowed to live here. We will now turn to an interior of what these houses look like. My wife and I went from door to door searching for relatives. Finally, it was through the website that we got into touch with Chia Leong Kia's great-granddaughter, Chia Mei Lin, who is in our midst today. I'm so honored. Who introduced me to the other Chia families. And we have David Chia with us. And from then on, I was able to access, to take pictures of the interior. You could see in the bottom left-hand side, Chia Mei Lin pointing to the photograph of her great-grandfather, Chia Leong Kia. This is truly historic. Architect Chu Eng Yam could have not done better to create a modern interior full of light and ventilation. It's refreshing just as it is modern. And yet it has a touch of the Tudor Edwardian style. And of course, I sought permission to go upstairs to see how it looked like. Patriarch Chia wanted families to interact together, so Chu Eng Yam created balconies which allow family members to talk to one another across the street. This is the kind of modern kampong infused into the townhouses. It's a wonderful interrelationship of townhouses and people. Through studies of the Lim and Chu professional practice, I was able to trace their ascendancy in the profession and construct a Malaysia timeline and architectural practice in general, extending from 1786, when Penang was founded as a modern settlement, to the year 2017, recording 217 years of architecture. And in my years teaching at the NUS, I began to realize a timeline is the driving engine to understanding the teaching of history and theory of architecture on the progress of architects. I believe that creating this timeline will assist the present and future researchers to concentrate the fields of interest of the period selected. So what had happened is that I have looked into the benchmarks of the timeline, starting from 1786 way up to 1927, when the Board of Architects came into action. And from 1927 to 1957, 30 years. 1957 to 87, another 30 years. 1987 to 2017, another 13 years and beyond, as a little benchmark where the researchers could focus their research on. Now let me quickly entertain you with a few slides to show how architecture and the profession developed. I cannot cover all, but the good news is you can all study the details in my book. Consolidating the practice is Lim Sulun and Chu Eng Yam. And you will find that Lim Sulun entered Penang in the golden age of architecture. He was actually studying in St. Joseph Institute in Singapore, St. Joseph Institution in Singapore. And Brother James found that he was such a great artist. He was put to work in the Public Works Land Office. And from Singapore, he worked in KL Public Works. And from then, he migrated to Penang and settled his career in there. And he obtained registration under the Board of Architects 1927, 1951, and 1967, and became, of course, a PAM member. So here you have someone who has been through the system of professional practice. Perhaps one of the most tantalizing work was this bungalow for Chung Lai Hin in the year 1917. I was fortunate to be there when it was still existing in the early 1970s. You may describe this as an eclectic form of streets architecture, where the rustication and the ornaments are essentially decorative treatments, if you will, distracting the purity of our architecture, because Penang Nonias love the ornaments in the sarong and kebayas and so on. But from the year 1917 to the year 1927, you will see the transformation. He now become more modernist. The decorations are very, very minimal. The focus is on the shape, the form of the architecture. And this would have been the high point of the golden age of architecture. But perhaps the most interesting is the own studio and house in Dunlop Road. Lim Soo Loon's own house and studio, 1928. Modernity here is expressed by the horizontal gravitas, the white box, but the windows betray a classical transition. You will notice the windows are 11 in the center with a fan light over the center. Upstairs in the first and the ground floor, there is this fan light in the center. There's a slight arch. We call that the leveling. And then on the left side is this cantilevered pile. I mean, this is only made possible by reinforced concrete. So in a way, you must say that he is very bold, that in the 1920s, when there was a love of the ornament, what happened is Soo Loon's own house is already striving for modernity. Again, in the next house, for the client Chia Sin Ki at number 17 Jalan Kalawai, this is a modernist house, even though the classical details might be in relief. The concrete flat roofs are introduced on the side and also in the front in the form of a semicircular dome, and is distinctly rigid and precise, bearing light and shade quality. This is one of the most cutting edge of the modernist movement, the pure lines. And we will move then to after the war. Enters Chu Ing Yam and his son Chu Kok Keng's solution for the house for Chung Hang Yong, 1959, corner of McAllister Adam Road. It has a certain quality of Le Corbusier, the flat roofed, the cantilevered porch, a touch of the Penang Swimming Club, which was just completed in the 1950s. The water groppius influence of the round windows and the corner details of the glass, all very severe and modern in those days. We'll now look into the next architect, Chu Ing Yam. Chu Ing Yam and Lim Soo Loon were both colleagues working as tracers in the office of New Brona. Henry Alfred New Brona, born in 1871, passed away in 1919 in Singapore. He arrived Penang in the year 1899 to begin a private practice. And we have Lim Soo Loon and Ing Yam working for them as tracers. And you might say that it was through that practical experience that they spawned their own practical practice and able to shine. So from a tracer to an architect, registered under the Board of Architects, 1979, 1951, then the Lambaga, 1967, and a member of PAM. So here we are, in the year 1918, he submitted a villa for Chung Lai Hock, which is today the McAllister Mansion. And what a way to start the practice. Your boss have retired, returned home to Singapore, I take over the working drawings, I submit a design under my own name, he becomes a socialite architect. A wonderful opportunity, which I call this the style of the castle mansion. Now in the 1920s, it was an Edwardian age, golden age of architecture. The effect of fashions of the interior, the love of lace and the tracery. And here is the dining room, 1922, residence of Encik Joe Sidek, who is here today. Look at the wonderful Edwardian lace. Look at the crown molding of the middle cabinet. And look at the lace that soften the element, perfect woodcraft. Those days were wealthy. You could afford to have craftsmanship doing beautiful things for you. Now, that's 1926. Now let's move on to the next slide. A dining room 10 years later. What does it look like? The economic recession set in. So no budget for fine craftsmanship. So the architect had to rely on stucco. Look at the triple console brackets. Okay? And the cupboards are now like casement windows. There's no frills. There's no craftsmanship. But it's still great, but it's a bit too masculine. But the economic downturn has caused architects to seek other solutions of the decorative. And this interior actually belongs to the Yellow Villa at Chow Tai Road. We will now move into Yellow Villa to show you the interior. Looking out, you will see that it's not wooden crafts that is in fashion, but cast iron lace, which was imported from Glasgow. So here we have the cast iron lace who performed the vital substitute for carved woodwork. And from the external view of the Yellow Villa, we shall see the same cast iron lace and also the balcony up there. And only above the chancel arch would you see woodcraft work, and of course the barge board over the oversized canopy. Essentially, 1935 was the modern period where concrete comes in. So the building is essentially rigid, it's modern in that sense, but it is softened by cast iron, by a bit of woodcraft, and so on. We shall now move on to the next slide. During the pre-war years, the Honorable Chang was in Singapore. A journalist from the magazine called British Malaya interviewed him and asked him which city would he prefer to live in, Singapore or Penang. Mr. Chang says Penang. Why? Just look at this house, known as Great Wall. Wouldn't you like to live there? Bracing fresh mountain air, cool climate for health, perfect for growing flowers and vegetables. Isn't this paradise? What is Singapore? The topography is essentially a series of low-lying hillocks. And even hillocks, they had to tear it down for shortage of space. So you have in here a paradise up in the Penang Hills. Looking from Great Wall down toward Georgetown, you could see the funicular railway going up the hill. I remember as a child in the 1940s, going up the hill, looking up a Great Wall and wondered, wow, the Amolau who lived there. So happy that the Dr. Osiuling is among us. She's one of the residents. And beyond Georgetown, the North Channel Sea, Butterworth, and even Bukit Matajam may be recognized. This is paradise in Penang. We will now shift to architecture as a piece of grammar. You may wonder why we chose this villa, house for Tan Chin Guan, 1936, to feature in our promotional posters. This villa shows that Chu's interpretation of modernity was still layered with colonial influences and enhanced with ideas introduced by modern architects of the day. Notice the arrangement of windows. They are deliberate. First, you have the 3 windows in front, focusing as the entrance portal in the middle section. Then 2 windows on both sides, and then the side shoulders with other windows set apart, giving you a sense of composition. And if you compare that to the Penang Club of 1968, it's actually the same configuration. So you have, in fact, Chu Ing Yam was struggling between modernity and the traditions, the classical style. And not only, look at the concrete porch on the right-hand side. The concrete porch on the right-hand side. It cantilevers out. And then look at the left-hand side. It cantilevers out as well. That's an architecture of Boucher. And then if you look at the top parapet wall, there are 2 females. They are torch motifs. Where did that come from? E&O Hotel, 1929. Why do we understand that architecture is really about society? It encompasses glimpses of buildings that, if you will, help to promote one's social position in society. And Chu Ing Yam was a social architect, and he did things like that intentionally. Now we would look at the radio house, which Dr. Judy Chang introduced earlier. As a result of the Penang Wireless Society founded in 1933, Chu Ing Yam produced a series of the so-called radio houses. Those days, radio hams require a radio room installed over the attic to receive transmission from the BBC London for news of the war in Europe. Well, here you have the radio room on the top floor of the attic. That's the radio room. And I knew this only because I was speaking to my cousin, Hock, who accidentally mentioned the word radio house. I was so excited. Quickly checked through the municipal drawings of the time. Sure enough, the working drawings actually used the word radio room. In another set of drawings, it says radio sanctum. So here we have historically the translation of culture into architecture. And of course, the cantilevered corner balconies, they come from the Kallang Airport in Singapore. So you have modern architecture laced with fancy and myths, if you will. And to me, this is Penang with all its wonderful ideas. There were many radio houses of the time. And so it is. Now let us turn to other forms of radio houses. Radio houses became so fashionable in those days that relatives of the deceased requested it as George houses for their loved ones after life. This is the case of a radio house, and the radio room is hidden behind the parapet, behind the vault, and the balcony set behind. But you will also notice the flying corner balconies after the model of the Kallang Airport. So you have social architecture brooding from the current life even to the afterlife. By the post-war years, the greatest contribution by Chu Ing Yam's father and son practice were the series of terrace houses. You could find them in Irrawaddy Road, you could find them in Kampung Melayu, in fact almost everywhere. I remember as a young boy going through the suburbs and I saw these grey strips of terrace houses. I didn't like them because they were not like those eclectic and wonderful 1920s. They were all very severe. But now we begin to appreciate that yes, it is Art Deco, there is a forecourt, there's a portal with an Art Deco profile, and the doorways were special, and the windows were special, and of course the corner balconies that curved out at the Kallang Airport. This new development that is evolved, I call it as the streamlined modern. And I'm sure that's part of our Penang house and identity. We will now proceed to the next slide. From the second wave to the third wave of architects. You will see in the blue arrow, the timeline now proceeds from 1957 to 1987. This was the time when significant changes were taking place. What do we see here? We see that the registration of architects of 1967 taking place under the Architects Act. The registered architect, the registered building draftsman, and so on and so forth. And who are the people, who are the faces behind this period? Let me show you. The Technical College in KL was the country's first post-war institution, which offered students training in architecture to the level of RIBA Intermediate or Part 1, whereupon graduation, students had to go overseas to obtain their RIBA Part 2. And here you have the graduates of the year 1966. That year, I also graduated in Melbourne. What happened is that the cohort of 1966 obtained the RIBA Part 1, and they needed to go beyond. And indeed, many of the graduates of KL Tech ended up in Australia, and I met many of them. And I'm also terribly excited that we have at least one architect in that photo who among our audience today. I'm so blessed. We will now move on to the scenario of the second wave of architects. This represents the work of a new generation of architects trained in the University of Cambridge, of Melbourne, of Sydney, and so forth. A stirring example is Johnny Hia's own house over at Biggs Road, now owned by Dick Yong, followed by Derek David's own house in Gertak Sanggol, and a modern kampong house for Dr. Iskandar and Tunku Idora at Telok Kumba by Derek David. We shall now move on to the next thing. These houses with the flat roofs appear to be the cutting edge of the time, such as Lim Chong Kiat, who designed the house for Dr. Arya, top left, and townhouses at Aratun Road. And of course, Eddie Yung was the exponent of the flat roof houses. This one here in sketch form for Lim Kien Siu at Ripton Road. And onward even to the spectacular, okay, namely Dennis Liu, who designed a house known as Margaret View, today known as Sutira House. It looks like a spaceship. It's spectacular. Then architect Tan Chong Kiat, who produced an indigenous Javanese Pendopos roof style for his own house at Hillside. And the bottom left, architect Ng Queng Sim, the only architect in the review whose own house here reiterated a more conventional form. Now we go to the next one, which is the third wave of architects, the period 1987 to 2017. I must at the same time emphasize that the architects who were already active in the second wave continue, and some of the contributions that happened to be in the third wave were particularly exciting and worthy of mention. Okay, so in the blue arrow, you will see the third wave of architects, period 1987 to 2017. That period was also very momentous because if you were a draftsman, you can no longer practice as an architect. Okay, so what happened was the registered architect continued to be so because he has formal qualification and practical experience. Draftsmen are no longer registered draftsmen to practice. They become architectural technologists, inspector of works. So you begin to see the gradual rise of the Malaysian architect to a more professional level. And let's have a quick review of those houses. We find individual architects look to the philosophical and occasionally mingle with some structuralism. I believe Lawrence Low leads the way, such as the Cascadia condominium and the urban sanctuary over there. And also, apart from the romantic approach, two houses at Puncak Bukit Mutiara Dua on Pearls Hill. These are perhaps the most exciting period of our local architects who are overseas trained, willing to push the age forward. I have two of my students in here, Chan Boon Hee, who produced what he called a flying roof house in the bottom left, and also a Balinese inspired house designed by Anthony Chan. And in the next slide, we have particularly something that is very, very different, very bold. I think the most stirring example in 2017 is a ramp house by architect Wee Hee Min of Kuching, made its entry into the local scene. The house, the shape, the plan is uniquely organized with a series of ramps running in between, in the glass section between there. Never seen before in Penang. Other interesting works are those of the Malay sensibility for Bertham Properties, Sindrin Berhad, produced by Atsa Architects in conjunction with architect Au Tayao. This review includes Own House by architect Farid Kamal, which is on the right side, and architect Ng Bing Chiang on the left side. They are all well considered and credible to represent the Penang house. Last but not least, a postmodernist house by architect John East Fu. Interestingly, in this great, can I say, complex forms, is a Baroque dome inside and a spiral staircase that reminds you of the Paris Opera, and is perhaps a benchmark contribution to the post-modernity. In the next slide, we must recall the conservation of historic buildings under the third wave. Two outstanding works mentioned in this book is the well-known Suffolk House, 1809, studiously conserved, studied by Lawrence Low and his colleagues. The Edison Hotel, top left, again studiously conserved by architect Matthew Tan. Now, last but not least, we would like to close the slide. Is this wonderful piece of temple that won a UNESCO award on merit. And the architect responsible is Tanya Wei. The late Tanya Wei was a conservation architect of the above project. In closing, I would like to pay my tribute to the late Tanya Wei, a dear friend of mine. He was always generous, sharing his resources, plans, slides, and time with me. Penang has lost a good son and a talented conservator. In conclusion, I'd like to recall to you that this timeline in relationship to the Penang House was created through more than 40 years of studies and research. I think this will be a great help to guide scholars and authors to pursue analysis in their topics. I leave you this, my legacy from Malaysia, my birthplace, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Lim. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lim will now take questions for a few minutes on the book. Please use the microphone that is located in the center aisle. Do share with us your name before asking the question.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karen. Thank you for your interesting presentation, Dr. John Lim. Please help us understand how do you account by your book's title, Rise of the Malaysian Architect.
Thank you. The words rise have a very strong, ambitious deal. We must remember that the grassroots architect had no qualification at all in the 19th century. And at that time, the proprietorship of architecture practice belonged to the military engineers, who then employed civil engineers. And the civil engineers, what did they do? They called themselves constructional engineers, acting as architects. For those who are brilliant, like Khu Gi Li, Ang Ban Ho, and Chia Chang Im, they had to obtain local scholarships sponsored by the Kongsis to study at the University of Hong Kong especially. They became civil engineers and upon their return called themselves constructional engineers. And of course there is a sibling rivalry. Where are the grassroots architects in this scenario dominated by the institutions? They are not members of RABA, they cannot be registered. What are they going to do? Well, in the case of the father and son architects, because of their track record, they were able to be registered as an architect under the board in 1927 and so forth. So they were able to rise out from the grassroots, should we say even on par with the colonial architects. But their sons could not be registered as architects. Their sons, like Chu Kok-king and Lim Yong Fong, were registered under a category in 1951 known as specially authorized persons. So it created a lot of unhappiness among qualified architects. Who is this specially authorized person? Is he a specially authorized architect with special talents and ability? So gradually, by 1967, this title, specialized person, were demoted. They would become registered building draftsmen. And finally, by 1996, simply as building technologists. So you see, when the overseas trained architects returned home and began to claim, their position, there was no way the term architects would be referred to anyone but a qualified architect. under the board of architects. So I believe that was the rise of the Malaysian architect. Thank you.
My name is Saul Sun. My question is more for the benefit of those, the lay people and non-architects. Can you explain the meaning of straight eclectic style architecture?
Thank you so much. You know, sojourners from overseas and writers love to use the word straight eclectic as though it is a style. It is not a style. It is a fashion. It's a fashion of the seaports from India to Penang to Singapore to Hong Kong to Xiamen and up. It was a style where Western influences were mingled with the local ideas of ornamentation. I remember traveling in Xiamen, the so-called Western style townhouses were so peculiar. The pediment was not even Baroque. It has a Chinese quality, even with dragons infused in it. So the straight eclectic is more likely to be called, in my view, the seaports eclectic. And to finish up this explanation, Peter Lee, who is an authority on the Peranakan sarong and collection in Singapore, he says this: in those days, to dress up badly is to dress well. And in fact, he has photos of how fashions were layered. He actually showed in his exhibition in Empress Place, Indian women wearing sari, and then they put on top men's shirt. And so you have this kind of eclecticism, a kind of freedom to experiment with great panache and style. Thank you. Thank you. If you read my book 1 on the Straits Architect and the Penang House, I actually relate a story about the sibling rivalry. The Crossroads architects were so successful that the colonial architects who were associated with the RIBA complained that no decent architect of the day could earn a living. So obviously, there was a sibling rivalry. So what happened was this: it became so serious that by 1924, they drafted an architect's bill for approval by the governor, stating, literally implying, only qualified architects from England are allowed to practice. And it was indeed the Chamber of Commerce who sent a note to the governor from Penang and Singapore. You cannot do that. If you do that, the whole building industry will collapse. So in the last moment, there was a caveat in the provisions saying that insofar as you can show a track record of competency, you may be registered under the provisions. And this is how Chu Eng Yam and Lim Sulun qualified by a competent track record. And I think they are the pioneers, the heroes of the Malaysian architects. And also, I want to tell you that Sheikh Ahmad Mir and his 2 brothers were also registered in Penang. Now let me tell you a little account. One of the reasons why it took 7 years to produce the second book is the difficulty of tracing the descendants of people like Sheikh Ahmad Mir. Another was Abdullah Nathaniel. Abdullah is Muslim, but he's also Nathaniel. So what is he? Is he Christian? is he Muslim? I spent 40 years running around the corridors, checking through the newspaper, talking to historians in Singapore. I still cannot track down. And in fact, the Edison Hotel, it was designed by Abdullah Nathaniel. And there is, of course, Muhammad Gauss and Tambi Kichil. And these are luminaries, but I could not get their life history. And I don't think my life is long enough to cover all this. That's why I need help through the Malaysian timeline. More work is need to be done.
Observation and also curiosity. Dr. Judy, you come out as a very inspired architect and also an icon in your field. But I'd like to ask a direct question about your 30 years, for example, in Singapore as an academician. That aspect. What is the failure rate that you encounter over 3 decades? Because architecture, as far as I'm concerned, I was lecturing in Oklahoma. The students come in, lack of sleep. At the end of the day, they fail their design, and they get so disenchanted. Some of them just never became anything along your field. It's just something to share.
Thank you. Architecture is a very strange discipline. It's not a science. It's not an art totally. It's somewhere in between. And that remains a problem, thus leaving to create a 2-tier system. The first 3 years, you are a Bachelor of Arts. And the next 2 years, you obtain a Master of Architecture degree. And under our system of intake in Singapore, at least I could say, there were no clear lines because the Ministry of Manpower were really looking not towards an art form, but rather through competency in design and production. And it's difficult to say the failure rate, but I will tell you one thing. Richard over there might remember those students who come to me for lecture in history of architecture must always pass my subject a compulsory question on Penang. If you don't pass my question on Penang, you don't pass my history anyway. The result of which I have left a legacy. Every year, students of architecture from Singapore do come to Penang. I know quite a few, and Richard is among them. I'm so grateful.
Good afternoon. My name is Lilin. I'm a Penang grad, and I'm taught with the Penang grad. So, in your personal or professional opinion, what kind of vision or what do you envision for today's architects or the future architects in terms of their design for the house in a piece of land, or houses in a large piece of land, or how they should restore an old building so that it will suit today's climate or today's lifestyle. Because the houses or the buildings in those days, they would serve certain purposes apart from just to go with the trend of those days. So what would you envision for today's architect or future architects?
Well, because I don't live in Penang, it's very difficult to understand what social responsibility is all about. But really, the case story in Singapore about urban conservation and conservation of houses is something which is well worth considering in Penang. I think that we have to start from grassroots in the secondary schools. we should have a volunteer program to explain to the students what it is, what heritage is all about, the richness of an East-West tradition intermingled in Penang. In short, we need architects to lead the way. That's my opinion. But I know this is a difficult, I got no recipe, so to speak, but thank you.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen?
I think that's my nephew.
So you skipped quite momentous and as well as historical period, that is the Second World War. So my question is, were the pre-war houses ever altered at the advent of the Japanese during that era? Whatever happened to the occupants of said houses?
Well, I don't know because I've not looked into that period where houses were altered under Japanese occupation. In many ways, it's a sensitive area. I know that many families fled to live in Penang Hill, and houses were left vacant in the many sense. But Penang was interesting because due to people, personalities, wise people like Hian Chu Xiang, but Penang did not suffer the kind of rampage that was done to Singapore, actually. Thank you.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? I guess this is it. Thank you very much, Dr. John Lim. Round of applause for Dr. John Lim. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank all of you for attending this official launch of the Penang House, Rise of the Malaysian Architect 1887 to 2017. Dr. John Lim is now available to sign the books. For those yet to obtain your personal copy, the book is available here today at a special cash-only price of 110 ringgit. The normal retail price is 135 ringgit. Please help yourselves to the refreshments served at the back. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again at another Entrepreneur Publishing event. Thank you.